This morning we have the privilege of having Shane Nixon bring the word for us this morning. And as Shane's making his way up, let me tell you a little bit about him. Shane has been a longtime Baptist minister. He served God in a variety of settings. He's worked for the Baptist retirement homes, the Baptist children's homes, and the Baptist State Convention. He's also served on the coordinating council of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship of North Carolina and on the board of ministers at a number of different universities, Wingate being one of them, and Campbell, another, from which he graduated. Shane was pastor at First Baptist Church of Moxville from 2011 to 2019. He currently serves as an industrial chaplain for Flow Automotive. That is very interesting. Yeah, there you go. Where he ministers to his employees, because Lord knows we all need ministering to. Shane and our Pastor Nelson have been wonderful friends for many, many years, and we hope that he will be a friend of First Baptist as well. Shane, welcome to the pulpit.
Thank you. It is a pleasure and privilege to be here this morning. I think it's interesting that over the years I have heard great things about this wonderful church, but one of the things that most always gets discussed is how the legend, as it were, of preaching in this church is the highest of high standards. I have had the privilege, and indeed it is a privilege, to call three of the pastors who have donned this pulpit my friend. One of them who is gone on, Dr. Frank Campbell. Another who is here with us today, Dr. Jack Causey. And a third whose place I gladly take today, Dr. Nelson Grenade. It is fair to say that I am no fourth on the Mount Rushmore of great preachers from this church. In fact, it is fair to say that the only time my name gets mentioned with those other guys is when somebody says, "That's Shane Nixon. He's no Frank Campbell, no Jack Causey, no Nelson Grenade." Reminds me of a story of the late, and in my mind at least, great Jerry Clower. Now there's a preacher if ever there were one. Jerry Clower once said that there was a young man out plowing in a field one day before the days when we all had tractors. He plowed along behind an old mule. A tractor salesman pulled up to the town he was in and came to rest just outside his plowing distance beyond a fence, motioned for the young man to come over and see him. The young man stopped what he was doing, came over to where he was, and the tractor salesman, trying to make conversation, said to him these words, "You'd think maybe you'd wait till the cooler part of the day to plow, huh?" The young man looked at him and said, "It's going to rain in the afternoon, got to make hay while the sun shines." The tractor salesman, not to be denied, said, "Well, I noticed that some of the corn that's coming up over there is kind of white. Maybe you'd prefer some yellow corn." The young man said, "Well, I planted white seed." Tractor salesman was persistent, if not bright. And so he continued along and said, "Young man, I noticed that your rows are kind of crooked. Maybe if you had a tractor, your rows would be straighter." The young man looked at him and said, "You can grow more corn in a crooked row than you can in a straight one." Tractor salesman propped himself up on a fence, frustrated, and said, "There don't much separate you from a fool, does it, young man?" Young man said, "Just a fence." I'm no fool. I know more separates me from the great pulpiteers who have called this pulpit home than the pulpit. Hopefully today, though, I'll do them justice. I'm pleased to have my friend Jack Causey with us this morning. I know how he served you. I know the grief he has recently been through, and it is a pleasure and honor to get to preach with him in the house today. Enough about me and on to our subject. I want to confess to you that preaching in the context of current events is hard. And I want to confess to you that living in the context of current events, especially living as a Christian, is even harder. Most of the headlines are about hate crimes. Destruction dominates most discussions. The context in which we live out Christianity is confusing. Politics divide us. Indecisiveness paralyzes us. And faith, well, faith only complicates the issue. This is hard stuff to talk about, and even harder to live in as Christians, as I've said. The best news blurb I saw last weekend is the saddest thing I've ever heard. One of the talking heads said, "We can't even talk about yesterday's mass shooting without asking which one." There is agreement. Everybody wants something done. The problem is, seems to me, that nobody knows what to do. If only we could simplify this, or perhaps have God simplify it for us. You've heard read beautifully the text this morning. I'd like to simplify even that. Reduce that has been read to one verse. Great preaching, as this church has had, would want to warn us of any preacher who comes with a one-verse text, because context is of utmost importance. Today, context comes in two parts. First, the Apostle Peter, who wrote these words or had them written for him, certainly dictated them. The Apostle Peter, we need to know the context of what he has written, and you've heard that read. Peter is talking about what you and I owe to the authority that is our government. In fact, if your Bible is one of those that puts those little caption headings above sections of text to give us a better understanding of what it is, then it may say something like submission to government. Be careful with those. They're not part of the divine inspiration that you and I cling to in a cherished way. But any good commentary would certainly say that this is what Peter is talking about. That's the first bit of context that you need. The second bit, and what I believe to be the more important context, though, is something not quite so explicit. Please first hear the words that were read to you again, this time just the 15th verse, and this time from the New King James Version. This is 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 15. "For it is God's will that by doing right, you should silence the ignorance of the foolish." A couple of words span translation. That is, no matter what version you read from, whether it's a paraphrase like the Living Bible or whether it is something more concrete like the New Revised Standard, no matter what, two words will carry over: right and foolish. We ought then to draw our attention to these as part of this second degree of context. You see, Peter had been with Jesus throughout Jesus' ministry, and specifically had been with him on that day when Jesus took to the side of a hill and delivered the greatest sermon ever preached. Speaking of good preachers, Jesus delivered that sermon that you and I have come to know as the Sermon on the Mount, and in doing so, prepared a tongue lashing. Now, we ought to stop right here and say this. Peter knew a thing or two about tongue lashings. I empathize, sympathize, and find myself in collaboration with Peter in this regard. I am not above having been tongue lashed. In fact, I was that kid. Every teacher, it seemed, had a specific and particular tongue lashing that they had reserved for the day Shane Nixon came to their classroom. And they took great pride, it seemed to me, in delivering it with venom. Tongue lashings. Peter had been a part to many. We need think no further than that night in the Garden of Gethsemane when Peter drew his sword and lopped off the ear of one of the guards, and Jesus, in an almost unbelievable way, turned on Peter. And so, in that great sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus, after he had talked about the Beatitudes, and after he had encouraged us to be salt and light and let our light shine on a hill, after he had done all that, he warned Peter and the disciples and all who were there to hear that day that they should be careful with something. I wonder if you'd hear these additional words of Scripture from the 5th chapter and the 21st and 22nd verses of Matthew. You have heard, Jesus speaking, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of judgment. But I also say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of judgment, and whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be in great danger of the council, and whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. This is the context. Peter, who heard Jesus warn him, don't call anybody a fool. Don't say to your brother, that is foolish. For those words, Jesus warned, carry with them judgment. And furthermore, to say the word out loud, to call your brother a fool, carries with it not just judgment, but the judgment of hellfire, Jesus said. That's the context. Peter knew better. Peter knew that to call his brother a fool drew the ire of Jesus. Peter knew that to call his brother a fool would make the hair on the back of his Lord's neck stand straight up. And yet, Peter, fully aware, having been tongue lashed many times, hears that tongue lashing and says to the church and says to us, do the right thing. Let everything else fall away. Do the right thing. And if somebody else has got something ignorant to say, then they are a fool. Now, I want you to think about that for just a second. Peter had been told to call your brother a fool is a ticket straight to hell. And yet Peter says that when we are thinking about what our call to action is, what we ought to do is do right. And we ought not worry about anything else. And if somebody else worries about it, well, then they are foolish. We've gotten good at calling our brothers and sisters fools, haven't we? From national news to church parking lots. We've gotten good at pointing the finger of blame and calling each other out, from radio call-in shows to online call-out tweets. We seem to have gotten the priority so wrong, but relax, this morning I have good news. This is understandable. After all, Peter's instruction here is ambiguous at best, isn't it? Do right? Do right? By whose definition of right? Under what understanding of rightness am I to act, Lord? When Peter says do right, he could not be more ambiguous. Whose definition of the word will we use, and which party do they represent? Or what right do they have to define right for me, and what right are they asking me to give up in order that I do right? Well, of course. The Bible is a little more explicit than that, isn't it? Jesus, over and over again, told us that we should love one another, that they will know us by our actions, that the right thing to do is to love. There are explicit demonstrations of this. And even in the very same Sermon on the Mount that Jesus ushered this morning, that Peter is either ignoring or being careful with, Jesus told us how to do it. He said, be salt and light, of course. But I don't know if you're like me. It feels to me like the world's gotten salty enough. And it feels to me like the darkness sometimes wins. Luckily, that's not the only instruction Jesus gave. That's not the only time he tried to spell out this rightness for us. No, there are these beatitudes. But you tell me if you think meekness, mercifulness, and being poor in spirit can stop mass shootings and political turmoil like we have today, we're going to need a little more than do right, aren't we? Maybe not. My father, for 27 years, worked for R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company in Winston-Salem. He tells the story that in the summer of 1981, an African-American gentleman named Shelley Giles, then about in his late 50s, was the elevator operator at the big, what they used to call the Reynolds Building in downtown. Many of you will know it as the Empire State-looking building. Mr. Giles ran the elevator that carried the executives up to the top floors and made sure they got where they were going on time and took the old-fashioned elevators where they needed to be, and he had become a bit of a local legend. He'd say little catchy things to the folks who were going up, and everybody knew him, and everybody spoke to him, and everybody liked him. He'd been at Reynolds more than 30 years when in 1981, his teenage son, Lamar, graduated fresh from high school, needed a job. One of the people that Giles had befriended over the years was the vice president of R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, a man named Will Haynes. Mr. Haynes and Mr. Giles had become good friends, and the kind of friends that knew that it was okay to occasionally ask a friend for a favor, and so that is exactly what Mr. Giles did. One Monday morning, when Mr. Haynes got on the elevator, Mr. Giles met him and told him of his son who, in his own words, needed a job to keep him out of trouble. Wondered if he could put him on the line, boxing cigarettes. Of course, Mr. Haynes obliged and did so immediately. And almost as immediately, the people who did the production counts and the quality control at the end of the line on which Lamar Giles now worked began to notice something. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 packs of cigarettes a day had gone missing and went missing consistently. It didn't take a math major to figure out that Lamar Giles, a 2-pack-a-day smoker, was taking from his employer. Will Haynes could not believe it, would not believe it, did not want to believe it. And so he insisted that the quality control folks count again, and they did. And they were still consistently 2 packs short. And so he had them count again and again and again, 7 times. I'm not sure that that wasn't biblical, but 7 times he had them count, and 7 times they found almost identically the exact number of cigarettes that Lamar Giles smoked were missing from the number of cigarettes produced and packaged on the line. Will Haynes lost sleep, he later said, because he knew what he had to do. He had to fire the son of this man who had become more than an elevator operator, but in fact was his friend. He was so riddled with guilt and shame, Mr. Haynes, that after he fired Lamar Giles, he began to take a different route to work through the Reynolds building and rode the freight elevator for 6 weeks in order that he might avoid Shelley Giles. The flu broke out at R.J. Reynolds, and several of the elevator operators had to be switched around and put in different places. And on a morning in January, the year after that, 1982, Shelley Giles happened to be working a freight elevator when Will Haynes stood in front of it and watched the door open. Will Haynes tells the story this way. He says that Shelley Giles looked at him and said, "Mr. Haynes, I don't know why you've been avoiding me. If it has to do with my son, don't worry. Because, Mr. Haynes, there ain't no right way to do wrong." Will Haynes and Shelley Giles embraced, renewed their friendship, and Will Haynes went to his office and ordered a sign made that day, letters 7 inches tall, on a wooden plaque that hung behind his desk. To the end, it said, there ain't no right way to do wrong. My brothers and sisters, it is my contention that Peter wrote the words he wrote. Do right. Just do right. Don't worry about what people think and don't worry about what people say. Don't worry about anything. Just do right. There ain't no wrong way to do it.